All right, so I just want to start off by thanking my co-authors. Scott Peterson and Hillary Glandon are two other biologists up here at the Lake Michigan Biological Station, and Syracuse Chesney is our field station director. A lot of this work is funded by the federal aid sportfish restoration program. So you can want to talk a little bit about who we are, in case you haven't heard of us. We are part of the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is kind of a unique entity. There's not a lot of similar organizations in other states. We've been around since the 1850s. We've kind of moved around to different universities over time. For a while, we were part of the DNR. For about the last 15 years, we've been part of the University of Illinois as one of several state surveys. There's the geological survey, archaeological survey, water survey. We're all part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois, at Urbana-Champaign. So we're one of a few field stations that are kind of scattered around the state. So you can advance it. We've been around. The Lake Michigan Field Station has been here since 1985. I don't remember if there's another bullet point or not. Yeah, so generally we're contributing, conducting research that contributes to science-based fisheries management and ecosystem management. So this is a couple shots. The brick building here is our old location. We do still have some space in there, but it's prone to flooding and roof leaking. So now we are in this triple wide trailer in the parking lot at the north unit of the state park up there. So not super glamorous, but we do get to get out on the boat quite a bit. We've got 3 research vessels that we can conduct some work on the lake with. So we do some things related to long-term monitoring of nearshore fish and invertebrate communities, yellow perch ecology, and our Creel survey is our longest running annual program. It's been going on since 1985, really in a consistent way since '86. We also, as part of the university, have grad students that work with us. So in the past, we've had projects involving food webs in Lake Michigan, yellow perch predation on gobies, and looking at zooplankton abundance and whether or not habitats are suitable for big-headed carp, just as a few examples. We have some other short-term projects as well. So in the recent past, we've been doing a lot of work mapping some offshore spawning reefs for lake trout. I think this is Wilmette Reef here. Will probably knows better. More recently, we've been working a lot. These are the small pilot rock project that we have going on. We call it the Rebel Ridges. This is near the old nuclear power plant in Zion. So these are submerged in, I want to say, the outside edge of this is maybe 12 feet, 15 feet. So pretty close to shore. So we've been doing a lot of work there the last couple of years, trying to understand kind of the ecological impacts of these rocks. And the short story is that there's a lot of gobies there. This probably isn't surprising. But, you can go ahead.
Is that below the water line?
Yeah, those rocks are below the water line. And there will be some hazard buoys going out within probably a month or so. So they're always marked on the north and south ends with some hazard markers. I think they're buoys. There's a lot of other stuff in the water there. Not a great spot to be blasting through there anyway, but
they'll be going through there.
Yeah, we've seen, yeah, a few people when we're out there diving, it's kind of scary. But coming up this year and for the next couple of years, we're going to be doing some work related to smallmouth bass movement in southern Lake Michigan and the Calumet River system. So we're pretty excited for that. So I want to kind of begin what I'm talking about with just a quick update of the Creel survey and what we saw last year. These are kind of our total numbers, about 230,000 hours fished in Illinois waters last year. This is all non-charter fishing, so it doesn't include charter trips. It was a good year for coho salmon. You can see for most of the salmonids here, we had a better year than we did the previous year. perch were down. We had an estimate of only 830 perch caught in the summer months for all of Illinois waters. So pretty. And I just also want to point out, compared to the 10-year mean, we were down for most things, but if you want to advance it one click, because we saw so many cohos last year, our combined trout and salmon harvest was actually above the 10-year mean last year. So you can go to the next one. We also conducted a fall and winter creel survey, like we have been doing the last several years. It's too early for some numbers there. We're still doing some quality checks on the data, but we generally saw similar things to previous winters where we see good success at Navy Pier and the south side slips. One thing that stood out this year is pretty good size for winter perch. Our average length in our measured fish was over 10.5 inches. I also want to point out that we have seen the last few years a lot of lake trout being caught from shore. So if you don't have a boat, there is an opportunity to catch lake trout if you want to get cold in the winter. And we all know that there was basically very little winter that happened this year. So that affected the ice fishermen, not a lot of access to ice fishing in the harbors, but also was beneficial for boaters. Calumet boat ramp was open most of the year. So. Okay, and I want to take this moment before I get into kind of the focus of my talk to thank all the Creel staff who have helped out with those Creel surveys over the years. I was looking at some numbers recently, and I think we have over 100 different people that have helped with the Creel surveys since '85. And a lot of these are early career professionals, just got their bachelor's degree. This is one of their first jobs in that field. So they're trying to gain some experience. They put up with a lot of different conditions, weather-wise, people-wise. So I do really appreciate all the work that they put in. And I also want to thank all the anglers who have helped out with our Creel surveys over the years as well. We really couldn't do anything without your responses to our Creel staff. And I appreciate especially the people who are respectful of our Creel staff, and it always makes their day a lot better when they have a good interaction with the people fishing. So. All right, so what I'm talking about today, we're going to talk about fishery-dependent data. And what that means is those are pieces of information that we collect from the fishers or the fish that they harvested. So that's in contrast to something like assessment netting or electrofishing, where you're trying to assess fish populations. People fishing are not necessarily fishing randomly. They're trying to catch fish and usually trying to catch big fish. So if you want to understand what's going on with the population itself, you want to do some sort of assessment survey. But it's important to remember that fisheries management is kind of at the intersection of not only fish and habitat, but also people. And it's kind of important to understand what's happening at the endpoint. One of the major endpoints of good fisheries management is a successful, healthy fishery. And so Creel surveys are really a good way to assess that. And because of that, all of the Lake Michigan states conduct their own Creel surveys. We all do things a little bit differently, but we're generating similar kinds of estimates. And that can be really important as a tool for lake-wide management. So we know how many hours are spent fishing, targeting different species throughout the lake, how many fish are being harvested of different species. So it can be a good way for decision makers to decide how many fish should be stocked or what the regulations should be. It's important to point out that it's not only important on that scale, but also locally for things going on in Illinois as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been conducting our survey in a consistent way since 1986. So some nice comparable data there. And this is some of the information that we collected. So it's not the most bright, not the brightest picture. This is the total time spent fishing by anglers targeting yellow perch for each year since 1986. Pretty obvious downward trend here. And I just point out the color scheme, but the gold is shore fishing, blue is boat fishing. That's going to remain the same throughout the talk if you want to advance it here. That's significant because yellow perch are typically an easy species to catch. A lot of people grew up fishing for yellow perch. It's one of the first species a lot of people caught on the Great Lakes. You can go ahead. They're also an important food fish, not only for anglers, but throughout the Great Lakes. They're really kind of ingrained in Great Lakes culture, available at a lot of restaurants. Another thing I want to point out here is we're in a little bit a different situation compared to other parts of the Great Lakes because we're a highly urbanized environment here. So in some ways, this trend, this downward trend in fishing effort is consistent with what we see in a lot of urban areas. Overall, generally declining interest in fishing. So it's kind of unfortunate because for a lot of people that live close to the lake, maybe they can't travel long distances without getting frustrated. But it's kind of this important connection to nature that's kind of going away a little bit. There's another angle on the population near the lake here that I think is useful to think about. A lot of our perch anglers live very close to shore. When we're in the city, sometimes people point, we ask how far they traveled and they point to the building, right? So they're living a block or two from the lake in some cases, and they can decide whether or not they want to go fishing. If the fish are biting that day, they go out the same day. If they're not biting, they don't bother. So that has an impact on kind of what we see as far as harvest dynamics. So I also want to point out we've been doing some wintertime surveys. So most of these years we're just doing April through September. But yeah, there's a few years where we have some wintertime data as well. And click it again. Some additional pieces of information we collect include harvest age composition. We collect the anal fin spine, which we can get an age estimate on the perch from that. That started in 2004, and then we've been looking at the harvest sex ratio since 2014. So if you want to click it again, there's a lot of animation in here. So, but I'm just going to focus on the last 20 years or so. So yeah. And this is the same information, same graph, just zoomed in the last 20 years. Still a lot of decline that's happened in that time. And the boat fishery in the summertime has almost disappeared. Click it again. This is our winter data, and it's a lot patchier, a lot of years that we missed early on, especially. But you can see it's been pretty consistent, and actually the wintertime perch effort is actually exceeding the summertime effort in recent years. And the boat fishery is still around. Go ahead. So there might be a lot of ecological reasons for this. Quagga mussels and zebra mussels have really, a lot of you probably have been able to recognize that the water is very clear now compared to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. That means that the lake is less productive overall. And with that, we've seen less recruitment or successful, accumulation of perch at adult ages, and declines in alewife abundance. We have seen increases in this time period in goby abundance, and especially in recent years, some warm winter temperatures. So there could be a lot of impacts on fish just through ecological changes. So I just want to kind of point out where we're talking about for our surveys and where we see a lot of perch effort. In summertime, we're kind of covering the whole shoreline, and there's a couple of important spots include, if you want to, Montrose Harbor especially, but a lot of the north side Chicago shoreline for shore anglers, and then Waukegan, at least historically, was very important for our boat fishery. We do see some shore harvest as well. So yeah, just point out there's a lot of shore access, aside from the parking problems and other areas where access has been lost. There is, compared to other parts of this shoreline, a lot of access for anglers to the lake in the city. And so I have another picture. This is just kind of gives you an idea how much water is out there. So if you're a boater and no one else is out there fishing, you have a lot of ground to cover to kind of find where the fish are. So there's kind of almost a critical mass where if nobody's fishing for perch, nobody is finding the perch. You have to put in a lot of effort to find them. So, and for the wintertime, we're focused mostly on the city of Chicago. It seems like there's a lot more perch effort in the city in the wintertime, especially if you want to click Navy Pier area and the Southside Slips for shore anglers. We survey the 95th Street boat ramp at Calumet Park there. And a lot of those boaters, in contrast to the summertime, are fishing within Calumet Harbor or even up the Calumet River, potentially several miles up the Calumet River. So that's kind of interesting because there's a little bit of uncertainty about whether or not those are the same perch as what we're seeing out here. So we're kind of interested in what's going on there. And if you click it again, this is an example of what we see for the shore fishery. This is 85th Street slip. Really hard to see in this light, but there's about 60 anglers here and they're all on private land. So that's frustrating for our Creel surveys. We don't go on the private US Steel property. We just kind of have to wait for people for some time and hope they finish in the time that we're there, and talk to them at that point. So there have been days where we see people catching perch and we don't end up talking to anyone. So I know we're probably underestimating the wintertime perch fishery just a bit. So if you've ever been creeled by our staff, you're probably familiar with this, but we have a questionnaire. Some of the things we ask include, how long have you spent fishing? What are you targeting? How many have you caught or released, harvested or released? If anglers let us handle a fish, we'll measure length and weight. And if we can collect samples, we'll remove the anal fin spine. So there's a picture of that on the next slide. So this is what it's, the first two anal fin rays are spiny rays, so we can clean those up. That's all the fin tissue has been removed there. We section them with our low-speed saw, and this is, if you're lucky, this is what you get, a very clean picture. You have these annuli, these annual growth rings, just like trees, and then we can count them. Yeah, so it's not always as easy as Sesame Street makes it out to be, because this is not always this pretty. So, but generally get a good estimate of age for most fish. So, and finally, we'll take a photograph of the urogenital papilla for yellow perch. That's what this is. So males have a round or D-shaped UGP. Females have triangular or crescent-shaped UGP. And the reason we care about that is because there's sexual dimorphic growth in yellow perch. So what that means is females are growing larger, faster than the males. So for example, this is some older gillnet data from our office, but 250 millimeter yellow perch, that's about a 10-inch perch. Females are being harvested as early as age 5 in this data set if you're trying to catch a 10-inch perch. And for a male, they might not reach that big until age 9 or so. So potentially females are more vulnerable to harvest by anglers than the males would be. So we want to keep track of that. All right, let's talk about some results. So we do see this is the total harvest now, not effort. So this is the total number of fish harvested as estimated by our Creel surveys. It looks a lot like what we saw in our effort data. So you might ask, are these lower numbers just because there's lower angler effort? And so we can account for that effort by calculating, if you want to go to the next one, the harvest rate or the number of fish harvested per hour. So you want to click it again. Our harvest rate, we just take the number of yellow perch harvested and divide it by the number of hours spent by anglers targeting yellow perch. So this is analogous a little bit to like a running back yards per attempt, or yards per carry stat, or there's some per minute statistics, I guess, in the NBA. So you're just kind of counting for that fishing effort. It might be more representative of kind of angler success on an average trip. So this leads to some interesting numbers, like not whole numbers. So half a fish per hour, nobody's harvesting a half a fish, right? But you can kind of invert that to think about it a different way if you click on this. So half a fish per hour basically translates to, it takes 2 hours on average to harvest one fish, 2 hours of try. So it's a bit more representative of angler success on an average trip. Obviously, there can be good trips and bad trips. If you're a running back, you might break out 1 yard or one run for 90 yards and then have a whole bunch of 2-yard carries. We see similar things in our fishing data. There's a lot of zeros, right? A lot of trips where people don't harvest anything, but then there's other trips where people are harvesting relatively high numbers of fish. So. And this is what our data look like for harvest rate. So the blue again is boats, gold is shore fishing. In the summer months, you can see it's relatively low, around 0.2 fish per hour recently for the shore anglers, and relatively high in the winter months, especially for boaters. If you want to click it one more time. So for example, this bar here would indicate it takes about 5 hours to harvest one perch in 2021. And then if you click over here, for boaters in 2020, it took about 27 minutes to harvest one perch. And I do want to point out our boat effort includes the whole trip. So we include the time that people spend searching for perch, from the time they launched, looking for perch. They get on the school, they fish for perch, and they drive back. So all of that's included in our time. So once you're on the school, you're probably catching a few more than that per hour. Let's talk a little bit about the size that we've been seeing. So this is one way of showing our sizes. The lines here are error bars. This kind of gives you an idea of how much spread there is in sizes. So for example, this year in the shore fishery, a lot of the fish were similar in size, and this year there was some big differences in the sizes that we saw. But generally, boaters are harvesting larger fish than the shore anglers, and that holds true across both seasons. What's interesting is that for both boaters and shore anglers, we see smaller fish being harvested in the winter months, which I don't think is surprising to anybody, but it is interesting that it's so consistent. Another way of looking at our size data is through length frequency graphs. So this is the summer shore fishery. And so if you want to click it again, for example, the 9 to 10 inch bin here, that's this bar. That's at about 0.21. So fish between 9 and 10 inches in the summer shore fishery typically make up about 21% of the harvest. If you click it again, fish between 15 and 16 inches long are typically about 0.2% of summer shore harvest. So about 2 fish for every 1,000 harvested are 15 to 16 inches long. And so we can look at that for all of the segments here, both seasons and both shore and boat. Short data here are what we saw before. The boat data are pretty similar, except shifted slightly to the right. So we see a peak in the boat fishery between 10 and 11 inches versus 9 and 10 for the shore fishery. And in the wintertime, one thing that you'll notice is that we see smaller peaks, smaller fish. So a peak in the shore fishery for that 8-inch bin and a peak in the boat fishery for that 9-inch bin, but also a much narrower range of sizes. So we don't have bigger fish contributing to the harvest like we see in the summertime. So that's kind of interesting. All right, let's talk a little bit about the age of the fish. And similarly, we see a wide range of ages contributing to the summer fishery. Especially boats, we see a lot of old fish. You know, this is 9-year-old fish are, 10 to 15% of the harvest for the boaters. Winter time, we see much younger fish on average. So summer fish are peaking at about age 4 and winter fish at age 3. And again, a narrower range of ages. So we can take that age data one step further and think about year classes. So I'll talk a little bit about what's a year class. Year class is just a group of fish that hatched in a given year. And that can be kind of a useful tool to think about how populations are put together. So, okay, again. So if we can keep track of that year class through time by aging fish, so that might be with the spines like I talked about, otoliths or the ear bones you may have heard of, you can age those. Sometimes people use scales. You can get some annuline scales and age the fish that way. But then you can track, for each year class growth through time. So you might have some year classes that grow really well and some that don't. You can see when they enter the fishery, and you can sort of index each year class's impact on the adult abundance and the harvest and mortality for each year class. So you can have some successful year classes and some not successful, and that can be driven by a variety of factors, including the number of spawning adults out there, right? So if you don't have any or very few spawners, you're not going to get a lot of babies out of that. And then also environmental conditions. So even when you have a lot of spawners, you can still see a lot of variation, mostly driven by survival early in life. So those egg and fry and juvenile stages. So this is really a most useful tool for fish that spawn once a year. So perch are a good example of that. It doesn't work well for things like round gobies, or if you go to like a lot of inland lakes, you'll see sunfish species, bluegills, pumpkin seeds, they'll spawn multiple times per year. So it makes it a little muddier and harder to track. So I'll just kind of run through an example here of using our year classes to think about how each year class contributes to the harvest. This is data from the harvest year 2014. And you can see this 4-year-old bar is really big. So if you click it once, that's the 2010 year class. So catch in 2010, 4 years later, 2014 is 4 years old,
That's
right?
the last bumper crop.
That's not the last one, but it's a good example because it really sticks out compared to the surrounding years.
That's bumper crop.
Yeah, there were I'll show you in a bit. You'll see a little more. So you can kind of collapse that down into a single bar, stack that bar up for years. So you can see that 2010 year class comprises about 75% of the harvest in the harvest year 2014. So you click it again. And you can kind of follow that year class through time and see that there's some other strong ones. 2015 is a good example. In the blue here, that was a strong year class. Even showed up in 22. And so that's one piece of the picture, right? So that's the percent of the harvest, but it doesn't account for how much harvest changed from year to year. So we can look at the overall contribution by multiplying that by the harvest rate. So this is the harvest rate varies from year to year. Click it again. So for example, the proportion for each year class by the total harvest rate will give you the year class specific harvest rate for each year. So if you click it again, for example, that 2010 year class, the overall harvest rate was a little over 0.6. But once we multiply it by just the proportion for that year class by itself was being harvested at a rate of about half a fish per hour at age 4. So this is now the 2010 year class plotted for each harvest year, right? And the numbers here are ages. So this is typical in fisheries. Early on, 2011, 2012, 2013, there are a lot of these 2010 year class fish out there, right? They're just too small to harvest. So that's why they aren't contributing much. 2014, they got big enough. They're starting to be harvested, but they're also dying through time. So there's fewer and fewer as the years go on. So we typically see this pattern where we have a peak year. So that's the important part. Circle that. That's the peak year for the 2010 year class. And click it again. There's that peak year here. This is all of the year classes now for the summer shore fishery that we have data for. The gray years we have kind of insufficient data, but we know some were strong, like the 98 year class. So this 2010 year class is slightly above average, but for example, the 2002 year class was really strong, was harvested at its peak at about 1 fish per hour, and it peaked earlier in life. So maybe it was growing faster. Their peak harvest occurred at age 3. So it's kind of a lot of information here. But the key thing is if we draw a line here, we can look at which years are strong year classes and which years are weak year classes in terms of their contribution to angler harvest. So go ahead. And we can do that for each segment. So here's the summertime. Again, this is the same graph. This is the boat fishery. Boat ages tend to be a little bit more diverse, so there's multiple years. So no single year classes is as high. Click it again. This is the winter fishery. We have a shorter time series here. But again, you can see some strong year classes and some weak year classes. Click it again. This kind of puts it all together. And so what we're looking for is, we're kind of curious, are we seeing the same year classes show up in all of the segments of our fishery, both seasons and both boat and shore? And we do see some examples. We don't have winter data here, but 02 and 03 and 05 were strong in both boat and shore. 2010 was strong for 3 of the 4 segments, and also the 2015 year class was strong for 3 of the 4 segments. There's very little boat harvest happening by this point, so I wouldn't put a lot of stock into this lack of a strong year class. So there's some evidence that this is kind of the same perch all over, or at least the perch populations are being affected by similar things. So let's talk a little bit briefly about harvest sex ratios. This was a little surprising to me that we're relatively near 50-50 sex ratio through time. I kind of expected females to be caught more often than males. And there are some years where that shows up. For example, the 2018 year, if you click that, That's that, if you remember, there was a strong year class in 2015. So this is kind of consistent with 3 years later. Some of those females are growing faster. They're probably being harvested at a higher rate, and the males are maybe too small that year to be harvested. So yeah. Go ahead. So just to summarize, generally, in the last decade or so, winter fishing success for perch has been better than summertime. Um, Fish length is generally smaller during the winter months compared with summer, and fish age is generally younger for winter fish compared to the summer. We do see some consistency in year class contributions across segments and seasons, and sex ratios are generally pretty close to 50-50, although there's potentially some patterns that are affected by that actually demographic growth. So. All right, so it's easy to kind of get carried away, at least for me, thinking about all the ecological meaning of this, but it's important to remember that these are all data that are affected by human factors. So there's several things that I just want to remind us that affects what we see in the harvest, includes access driven by warm winters, so it doesn't just affect the fish. Information sharing is a big thing, especially in the age of social media. On the other hand, if no one's fishing, there's no information out there, and so like a kind of a critical mass for those summer boat fishers makes it tough. There's something called hyperstability, basically where anglers don't waste time when the fish aren't around. They're really good at finding where the fish are, and so you can see high catch rates even when the population is low. So that's just something to point out. Technological improvements have an impact. I think many of us recognize the proliferation of live scope and other similar technologies out there. And regulations is another impact as well. So we do see people limiting out in the winter months, not too often anymore in the summer. So it's just a reminder, all of these things are just a reminder that the fishery-dependent data are really good at quantifying what's in the catch. It's not a direct assessment of ecological factors, but it does lead to some interesting questions. So if you want to, so that leads us to some next steps. We're going to continue our winter creel surveys. We also want to link some of our small mesh gill net data. So this is another one of our long-term surveys. And so we're catching these young perch early in life, and we want to see if patterns in growth and abundance of these young fish is translating to what we see in the fishery a few years later. Finally, I talked a little bit about the Calumet River system. We are starting that small and fast work in that area this year, and we'll also likely be sampling some perch. But it's a new area for us. It's much different from the open lake that we're used to as far as working on the boat. So if anybody in this audience might work there or has fished there, has any experience, we're really interested in learning as much as we can about that area. So yeah, that's all I've got. So. Thank you.
So I think we have time for one or two questions.
How far will perch travel? We know salmon travel the whole lake. Perch pretty much stay per area, if they have enough,
Yeah.
Whatever, or will they actually see Indiana perch in Illinois and vice versa?
Yeah, so we will. So our office before my time had a pretty large scale tagging program. And some of the results of that project showed that the perch were moving kind of intermediate distances. So you'd see Wisconsin perch in Illinois, Indiana perch in Illinois, and vice versa. But you wouldn't see a lot of Illinois perch in Michigan, for example. So they're not moving super long distances, but there is some interstate movement for sure. There's also, I think, at a larger scale, when perch hatch, they hatch out of the eggs. They're 5 to 6 millimeters long, and they're carried by currents all around the lake, all around the South Basin. So the perch that end up settling in Illinois could have hatched in Muskegon, Michigan, or Michigan City area. So there's potentially more movement as these very small sizes are just kind of passive movement. So.